Hello, and welcome to the second podcast of Taking Back the Narrative. Our mission is twofold for the Zionism Education Initiative. The first is to fill in the 2,000-year historical quote-unquote gap not being spoken about much today from biblical times to 1948, proving the Jewish continuous presence to Israel. And the second of all is to reinforce correct terminology. And we welcome you. I'm proud to introduce our guest for today, Ido Reif. He and I met on social media, and like a lot of people, we were talking about current events in Israel, which somehow jumped into talking about the British occupation and how that's not an oft talked about topic today. And yet that time period very much still influences current events happening not just in Israel, but also the entire Middle East overall. Ido is a great guest for us tonight in that he has a master's in history from Bar Ilan University with a concentration in Jewish history and in ancient Jewish history, actually. And that will become very apparent not only in our conversation today, but also in a particular part when we start talking about the Jewish resistance groups that were finally retaliating against the British occupation period. Thank you, Ido, and we look forward to a great and invigorating conversation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. So let's just jump in. So can you paint a picture for our audience about the end of World War I, not just in Palestine? And when we talk about Palestine today, today in today's conversation, we're talking about today's Israel and today's Jordan, the region of Palestine.
Correct.
So can you further explain, okay, so the Allies were clearly winning. SaxbyCo, so these were two diplomats, if I'm correct, right? One British, one French. And in 1916, they had plans to carve up the former Ottoman lands. So
yes.
Take us back to what the Middle East in general looked like during that time.
Well, yeah, I think it's important to put SaxbyCo and pretty much everything else about that period into context. So we are talking about the First World War, the Great War as it was then known. And one of the belligerents in that war against the Allied nations, which were, of course, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and after a while, the United States as well. And against them were arrayed Germany, Austro-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire was already at the time called the dying man or the sick man of Europe. So the British actually did not anticipate a lot of resistance because they figured that they would have a relatively pretty easy go at it. They identified the Ottoman Empire as the weak link and attacked it almost as soon as hostilities became. And to their surprise, it didn't go their way at all. In 1915, Churchill, as first Sea Lord of the Admiralty, basically the Chief of Staff of the Navy, tries a very daring but completely catastrophic plan to capture Constantinople through Gallipoli. And pretty much from the start of the war up to around 1916, they also try to go in from Mesopotamia, what is today's Iraq. Both cases are complete failures. At this point, the British decide to change tacks. Instead of just bludgeoning their army again and again and again, what they decided to do is go to the native people of the land. So they go to the to the Arabs in Saudi Arabia. Well, it's today Saudi Arabia, back then was the Arabian Peninsula, and they go to the Jews of quote unquote Palestine. And I quote it because the Turks themselves, the Ottomans, never actually referred to Palestine as Palestine. This is a Western name that comes from the Roman term Syria Palestina, which was specifically used to erase Judea and the Jewish connection to the land after in 135, after the final Great Revolt, one led by Balfour. But let's get back on topic.
So let me ask you a question. So when you say that, it is a Western term, Palestine, and so correct me if I'm wrong, but I was reading that what is today Israel by the Ottomans was considered part of southern Syria. Is that correct?
Depends on which parts. There were what was called vilayets. This is the term, the Turkish term for province. Israel was actually between 2 and 4, depends on how you would like to view it, but basically 2 vilayets. The northern one was considered part of southern Syria. The northern one was kind of like, the Negev desert was joined up to the desert in, excuse me, what is today Jordan and Arabia.
And so, as we would call it, Palestine, right? So the Jewish Palestine, it was administered by different sanjaks, right? There were sanjak districts, and so those
Correct.
were Ottoman administrators.
Correct.
Who control. Okay, great. So if you can take us back, like you said, so and this is fascinating because I didn't even not know about those losing battles in 1915 and 1917. So when 1915, and you said 1917, correct?
No, 1916. By 1917, things started to turn.
To turn. So my question is, the SaxbyCo, that was in 1916. So what made them confident to start thinking about carving out those soon-to-be former Ottoman lands if their battles are still failing? To me, that's something interesting to explore.
Well, first of all, let's try to understand what the SaxbyCo Agreement is. Mm-hmm. It's a secret agreement, and it's important to note that it was secret between 3 parties. Britain, represented by Sir Mark Sykes, France, represented by the eponymous Monsieur Picot, and Russia, Tsarist Russia. Each one was supposed to be given an imperial sphere of influence. Remember, all 3 were empires, the kind that don't really exist anymore. But at the time, that's what they all were. Israel and Iraq would go to Mesopotamia, I should say, would go to Britain. Syria, which included Lebanon, would go to France, and most of Turkey would go to Russia. Now, I'm kind of jumping ahead a little here, but in 1917, when the Bolshevik Revolution happens and Russia becomes the Soviet Union, it both withdraws from this agreement and, more crucially, publishes it in the newspapers, causing a great deal of embarrassment to the other 2 parties, because by then the Arab revolt, as well as the Jewish alliance, shall we say, or help, clandestine and otherwise, against the Turks, is pretty much in full swing. But what's done is done, and basically by now the wheels are turning. You need to understand that we're talking about wars that involve millions of people, dozens of countries, powers, It's just something that starts 1 year, rolls into the next, and into the next, into the next. Especially in World War I, when you had battles that would take like entire years, like Verdun or the Somme.
Mhm.
So yes, what's important to note is the secrecy of this agreement, because neither the Jews nor the Arabs had any idea that this was going to happen. The Jews were led, first of all, there was a very famous spy ring called Mili, short for Netzach Israel Lo Yishaker, led by Zionist Jews in Israel, which gave General Allenby crucial information about the Turkish defenses, which allowed him to basically take Israel,
So-
successfully invade Israel from Egypt. And there were also a Jewish brigade, and we don't have enough time, but it was led by very famous figures in Zionist history called Jabotinsky and Trumpeldor. They fought, among other things, in Gallipoli. So you can see that this was, even though there was no Balfour Declaration at the time, you can see that the Jews are already, though technically the Zionist organization, the Zionist Congress, declares neutrality, they very much hope to use the war in order to regain a Jewish state.
And this is a great transition, because I, was just reading more about the Balfour Declaration. A lot of people erroneously think that it was some big, massive document, when in reality, it was one sheet of paper. It was very brief, and it was Lord Balfour very much just giving a approval to Lord Rothschild, and he was saying that we can go ahead, and actually I have a quote here. Let me bring this up, just 1 second. So in 1917, Lord Balfour, on behalf of the British government, ordered a declaration stating His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. This was incorporated into the British mandate. The Balfour Declaration became legally binding later at the San Remo Conference, and which we'll get into as well. So if you can also explain a little bit more. So how did this Balfour Declaration, this single sheet of paper, even come into play, right? So we have the World Zionist Congress. The Jews had, and this is not well known, that the Jews helped push back the Ottomans in Jewish Palestine at the time. A lot of credit is rightfully given to, of course, Australians who came to help, but you don't hear anything usually outside of maybe Israel. I attended public schools, never heard anything about Jews helping in World War I. And so I have, read many documents that it wasn't all favorable, right, within the British Parliament. They were pro-Jewish factions, anti-Jewish factions. If you can explain a little bit further about that, right? So was this something that was looked upon favorably, or was this just a one-off?
Well, it depends a lot on how you choose to view the Balfour Declaration, because as you very correctly pointed out, it's a very short and very it's not it's not a commitment. It's oh yes, we think this would be nice, and we'll do what we can to get something to happen. But while this is certainly the British Empire trying to kind of have their cake and eat it too. This was a tremendous, for Jews all over the world, this was a tremendous event, because for the first time, there was a great power actually recognizing the not the fact that Jews had a claim to their indigenous homeland, and saying they'll do whatever they can to help reinstate that lost sovereignty.
Mhm.
So yeah, whether the British intended that in 1917 or not, it had huge ramifications.
Mhm.
As you said, it was later reincorporated within the mandate terms of San Remo. But as for the British themselves, you need to keep in mind that pretty much since forever, at the time and still today, there is massive, massive ingrained anti-Semitism within the upper classes of Britain. And it gets pretty much more and more pronounced the higher up you go. Parliament was certainly anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist.
Mhm.
However, at this point in time, the British were really in we need everybody, all hands on deck kind of situation. And they had their own anti-Semitism led them to an erroneous view that exaggerated Jewish power throughout the world. They essentially tried to get the Jews in the world, the entire world, not just in Israel, to feel more kindly disposed to them. For example, to get Jews in the United States to pressure America to go into the war in order to fulfill Zionist dreams. Of course, Jews had nowhere near that kind of power, but oddly enough, ironically enough, because the British were anti-Semitic, they made the usual mistake of assuming Jews worldwide had more power than they actually did, or that they were unified more than they actually were.
Absolutely. So kicking Jews out en masse from England from in the 1200s was not enough. And now it's still being replicated during this time period. So you mentioned the San Remo conference. So I know that this cemented the legality of Judea and Samaria. And
yes, this is why I think San Remo is actually more important than the very non-binding Balfour Declaration, because this is the British Empire coming to the table in an international forum and says, we're ready to facilitate the recreation, the restoration of a Jewish state in the land of Israel, which they named Palestine. And now, San Remo was not just about that, of course. Among other things, it carved up the Middle East more or less the way the SaxbyCo Agreement had settled on, according to what I already said, the way I already described, minus Russia, of course, which became an enemy. But this is more or less what we got, only they didn't call it, they didn't actually incorporated any of those lands taken from the Ottomans into their respective empires. Instead, they called it a mandate. Now, what's the difference? Well, there's a colony or province and there's a mandate. A colony or a province are lands that you consider to be part and parcel of your own empire. It's just as much, India was just as much British as London, for example.
Right.
A mandate is still part of your empire, but it's more like a protectorate. Now, you don't send people to colonize it, but you do run it, ostensibly in order to get the natives to educate them and build infrastructure and help them along in sort of the white man's burden version of nation building.
Absolutely. And let's also, so just to add, to explain to our audience, so the San Remo conference was part of the larger League of Nations.
Yes, that's right.
Right?
The League of Nations was, ironically enough, an American achievement post World War I, which is ironic because America did not join it. President Wilson wanted it to join, but Congress said no, and that's what they were left with. So it was a precursor or a forerunner to the United Nations of today. In fact, a United Nations decision from 1945 determines that every single decision taken by the League of Nations is legal and binding to the United Nations, which means San Remo and other such decisions taken by the League of Nations are still binding today, as far as the United Nations is concerned.
Absolutely. And so also, just so people have a more clear picture, it wasn't just Jews pining for, independence. After World War I, it was also Assyrians, it was the Kurds, it was Jews, it was even Arabs. And they wanted to state their case, during the League of Nations to curry favor for their own independence for their homelands. And so what made the Jews slightly more successful than, say, the Kurds at the time or the Assyrians? Was it
I would say that was more of a presence in other nations, more communities, more capital, more influence, basically.
Right. And then also, like you said, like the backing of this empire, the British Empire.
Yeah, but the Kurds were also promised their own state, and nothing happened. But it's important to understand something, that though San Remo was the British Empire declaring that mandatory Palestine and which at the time was Israel and Jordan, and then just Israel. We'll get to that, I imagine. That these were set aside for a Jewish state. There almost immediately it became apparent that they were not going to keep their word on that. That was a very empty promise that no senior ranking politician in Britain had any intention of ever fulfilling.
And that's very interesting you say that, because in 1920, if you look at the map of the Jewish homeland, it's today's Israel, today's Jordan, and they did it according to the biblical tribes and where they were geographically located, which is why today, even in Jordan, they're still finding Jewish artifacts from thousands of years ago. And I'm not a religious person, but I believe at least a couple of Jewish holy sites are actually located in Jordan. And there's a video on social media from years ago, maybe 5-6 years ago, where these group of religious Jews had to dress as Arabs to go to these pilgrimage sites located in Jordan because they couldn't get into Jordan with their kippah and their normal clothes. And I will share that onto the Taking Back the Narrative website as soon as I can get some copyright acceptance from that. But and we don't think about that, right? We still think, Jordan has always been Arab, and whatever we have left of, Israel.
Jordan is actually a very interesting case, because this is something I wanted to discuss earlier. Didn't really have the chance, so I'll try to do it very briefly here. Just as the British in World War I approached the Jews for help, they also approached the Arab, if anything, for much more significant help. They approached the Arab tribe controlling Mecca and Medina at the time, the Hashemites.
So, I'm going to actually pause you for a second
Yeah.
because I want to just rewind a little bit to, again, set the time period. So, like you said, and this is very accurate, how the promise of that entire Jewish homeland based on historical data, historical geography was very short-lived. So San Remo was 1920.
Yeah.
2 years later, 1922, Churchill basically backstabbed the Jews, but it wasn't just his own doing. He was greatly influenced by Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, who was very much mired into the Arab world, and he sided with the Arabs, right? And like you said, so could you give us a little bit more insight into why, A, why Churchill was so influenced, and B, why did Britain overall decide to basically cut off 78% of the Jewish homeland to create Transjordan in 1922 and deny that land to Jews?
Okay, so regarding Churchill, Churchill was minister of the colonies at the time. And as a politician, he was actually always for a Jewish state. But, well, if he had to choose between British interest and Jewish interest, it's obvious who he was going to side with. I do think there were higher ups than him that were influencing him in less kindly disposition to the Jews, but that's neither here nor there. That's the fact is that this is what happened. The white paper of 1922 came into existence, and the British, as you said, chopped off Jordan, restricted Jewish repatriation into Israel, while, and this is important to note, allowing vast amounts of Arabs, as noted by Bobby Kennedy, who was a journalist at the time, to immigrate and colonize Israel freely.
Exactly.
Today,
Coming from all over the Arab world.
Yeah,
That's why
exactly.
today you have
And more and further from Bosnia.
Exactly.
From
So
Bosnia.
that's why today we have that very infamous family, the Tamimi family.
Mm-hmm.
They are either half Bosnian, I'm assuming, or half Chechen.
So I've heard.
Yes, so half Bosnians. There were even Chechens who came over,
Yes.
from all over. And so, of course, and we can discuss further the makeup of what people today call Palestinians, which there is no such thing because Jews were considered Palestinians for 2,000
exactly.
years.
The Arab Palestinians actually hated that term because it was taken from Jewish history, and they saw it as a way to impose Jewish identity on them at the time.
Exactly. So you were mentioning very interestingly, and we just had to back it up a little bit more. You're talking about the Hashemites, right? So, here was Transjordan, which basically was a vast desert and, at times occupied by different tribes, before then by Jewish tribes as well. So who were those people living in Transjordan at the time that Churchill came in 1922? And who are the Hashemites? Where did they come from? And how did Jordan become Jordan?
Okay, well, as I said, the Hashemites during World War I were the tribe, the Arab tribe it was very powerful, very influential because it controlled Mecca and Medina, the two most sacred sites to Islam. Just like the British came to the Jews asking for cooperation against the Turks, they did the same to the Arabs. Remember, this whole area was, at least technically in theory, part of the weakened Ottoman Empire. Lawrence of Arabia was sent to the Hashemites as an agent provocateur in order to foment rebellion by the Arabs against the Turks, and he succeeded magnificently. And this is what is now called the Great Arab Revolt. The Arab revolt under Lawrence and Faisal of the Hashemites had tremendous gains. It cut, for example, it managed to cut the Hijazi railway, essentially cutting off Turkey from Arabia, and it at some point captured Haifa from them. The point is,
Ido, when you say Hijaz,
yeah.
so that's not all of Saudi Arabia. That's
No.
a section within Saudi Arabia. Do you know where are we talking about? Hijaz?
Yes, this is the eastern portion that borders the Red Sea.
Okay, so that's the part that's closer to Israel as we know it.
Yes.
Correct? Okay.
As I was saying, while the revolt itself was extraordinarily successful, it also left. It forced the Hashemite to commit most of the forces into it, thus leaving Mecca and Medina exposed to a different Arab tribe who had designs, who came in and just took it from under their noses. You may have heard of it. It's called the tribe of Saud, or Saudi Arabia, as it is now known.
Mm-hmm.
So the Hashemites were left in a very unenviable position because they had been promised a huge united Arab land from Mesopotamia to Yemen. And with the publication of the SaxbyCo Agreement, they were left with absolutely nothing, which is very tragic because before that happened, Faisal, who later became the first king of Iraq, and Chaim Weizmann, who later became first president of Israel, met in public and recognized each other's sovereignty over those respective lands, as long as the rights of minorities were not affected. So,
and that was the Weizmann Faisal Agreement, and this was also part of the San Remo conference, correct? And so
that was a bit earlier, but
yeah, a bit earlier. Right. So that was 1918. You're right.
Yes.
But they also met again during the League of Nations negotiations. And so from what I understand and from what I read, and maybe you can add a little bit more color to this. So King Faisal, like you said, in Iraq, he didn't even think to touch Palestine for Arabs, because Arabs in his
what does he have to do with Palestine?
Exactly right, because he knew that was Jewish land. And
exactly.
He said, what we want for Arabs, and you can correct my countries if I'm a little bit off here, they wanted Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and Syria to be this pan-Arab land.
Exactly.
Independent land.
But the facts on the ground was that they didn't have Arabia anymore. Saudi Arabia had Arabia, and and
was Egypt included in this Arab?
So absolutely not. Egypt was already an independent kingdom.
Okay, and when did they become independent? Do you know?
In the 19th century.
In the 19th. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So Egypt was off on its own, and so so Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and what was the last one we were saying?
Saudi Arabia.
Right, in Saudi Arabia, right? And so Saudi Arabia, they had this inner conflict between the houses at the time.
No, it was pretty much a done deal by then. The thing is that
he's already declared their victory.
The Hashemites no longer had the necessary forces to go back and reclaim the territory they lost. And as much as they asked the British to assist them, the British flatly refused, because the Saudis were more than happy to deal exclusively in oil with them, which ties into what you asked earlier, and I wanted to get to. You asked what happened to get us to 1921, 1922, and the British turnaround. It's this. It's the fact that there are riots, Arab riots in mandatory Palestine, It's the fact that there are way more Arabs than Jews, not specifically just in Palestine, but in the entire Middle East, which now the British and the French govern a lot of. And it has to do with the fact that oil becomes more and more important to industry. And as far as those empires know, this is where most of it is. So you better be nice to the Arabs because they have the key to the world's economy. Under those terms, the Jews just don't signify.
This actually leads to my next point is, and you and I were talking about this off camera in the weeks past. I always was wondering how come Jews were not allowed to have weapons of any sort. It was punishable by jail time, even execution, and Arabs were not punished for having weapons. But
Right.
so is that why they just were so quote unquote afraid of Arabs and they wanted to do right by them, that they had these two different standards?
Absolutely, yes. The entrenched British anti-Semitism certainly didn't help, but yes, the realpolitik was that Jews did not have the political power to be of any major influence. Arabs did,
Right.
both in population and more importantly in oil.
And so that's why in 1929, when it was the Hebron massacre, instead of punishing the Arabs, they just kicked out the Jews.
Yeah, ethnic cleansing, absolute ethnic cleansing from Hebron, from Gaza. Earlier than that, in the Golan Heights, done by when they weren't exactly sure on where the border with France is going to be. So when they did decide, they just the French kicked out all the Zionist pioneers in that area as well. And it also led to the famous Tel Chai incident of 1920, but that's getting off the topic. Anyway, so what we're going here is that you were asking about the Hashemites. The Hashemites basically found themselves, pardon my, they were screwed over by both sides now because they had nothing. They in spite of the successes, they literally had nothing. So they came to the British and more or less said, you guys owe us. You owe us. We gave you everything and we lost everything. And you're not giving us anything in return. So the British took a look around. They saw Mesopotamia, which was and still is a nightmarish mix of ethnicities and religions and sectarian strife, but it also has a lot of oil.
Right.
So they decided, well, let's make a mandate and then a country for that. We call it Iraq, and we'll take one of the leaders, one of the leaders, in this case Faisal of the Hashemites, and put him as a puppet king. And he doesn't have anything to do with Mesopotamia, but which was the entire point. With one stone, the British killed two birds. They put in charge a puppet king, which meant that they didn't need to run things themselves, but they also assured that the oil will continue to flow in their direction. Now, Jordan was basically the British trying to do the same thing twice with a certain amount of success. Faisal's younger brother was also involved, said he wanted a kingdom too. What, don't I get a kingdom? So the British at the time, by 1922, they're realizing there's a lot of fighting going on in Palestine. There's a lot of Arabs who are very violent. The Arabs in Saudi Arabia are threatening to cut off oil. Okay, let's try to appease them by chopping off the bit of the mandate east of the Jordan and putting in charge another Hashemite puppet king. It worked for Iraq. Why not here?
And that's why when people say the West Bank, right? Like thinking.
No, the West Bank is that's
it means all
in the
Israel.
future. That's
Right.
in the future.
No, but that means like, geographically, like with the West Bank means the West Bank of the Jordan River, which literally means all of
Yeah. All
Judea
of Judea and Samaria, which
and all
is
of
sort
Jewish
of like calling,
Palestine.
it's like calling Greece the south bank of the Danube.
Exactly.
It
Right.
makes
And
just as much sense.
exactly. So you're talking, okay, so let's rewind a little bit too about the I guess the population makeup of Jordan at that time, right?
Yes.
So was it mostly the Arabs within the British Mandate being sent over to this newly created Transjordan, or was it just these Bedouins that happen to live in today's Jordan? Suddenly they have a state. Like, if you could explain a little bit more who these
Okay.
people are.
So 20% of the population of Jordan are Bedouins.
Mhm.
80% identify themselves as Palestinians, which means that they were subjects of the British Mandate at the time when Jordan was part of it. That's all.
And so
That's it.
were they living on that land, or were they just flowed from
Well,
Israel over to Jordan?
they some of them escaped to Jordan during the Israeli War of Independence in 48. Prior to that, I am not aware of uh, any serious movements for a good reason. Jordan is almost completely desolate.
Right.
There's very small part of it is arable, but it's almost almost nothing, almost completely desert. So yeah, these were just the Arabs that were living there at the time.
And were Jews living in today's Jordan at all?
Jews were a small amount of Jews were actually living in today's Jordan and were again ethnically cleansed by the British, who had the law inserted into the Transjordan law book that said that Jews are not allowed to settle or own lands or become subjects or citizens of the Emirate of Transjordan. And that law is still in effect today in modern Jordan, which Israel has a peace agreement with.
Right.
In Alan Dershowitz's terms, Jordan is Judenrein.
Mhm. Which is true, absolutely.
Which is completely true.
Right.
I'm just quoting.
Right.
I'm just quoting to let you know that it's not me making up words. This
No,
is
it's
the
history.
situation as it currently stands.
Absolutely. And so you're talking about also just in overall, let's discuss British anti-Semitism, right? So
Mhm.
before World War II, you had, okay, so between 1922 and 1939, the British also had all these white papers, right? So
Mhm.
these were a series of anti-Semitic edicts concerning the Jews of Palestine. And the point of it was to impede the Jewish refugees' attempt to enter Palestine, even though in San Remo, they had promised that they will do everything they can to facilitate Jewish.
Yes, as I said, they completely reneged on every single
They've done
promise they
everything,
gave.
right. And so after the paltry Jewish immigration quotas were met, the Jews were even deported as far as the
Correct.
island of Cyprus. There were detention camps all over Israel, Atlit being one of the
Mhm.
most vicious one. So if you can talk about that a little bit. So they had these detention camps, right? When exactly did they start? Did it start during World War II? Was it before World War II?
It started a little bit before World War II. The infamous white paper of them all was in 1949, before World War II started, but you can pretty much see where the wind was shifting. And because of this, during all of World War II, despite frantic pleas by the Zionist movement led by Ben Gurion to the United Nations, because the League of Nations does not exist anymore, to let the Jews of Europe in. The British flatly refused, even though there was more than enough room for them. There was at the time, at best, 2 million, 3 million people in all of Israel. Today, there are more than 10. So you do the math.
Exactly, and they were actively pushing it back. So,
So as far as I am concerned, the British are directly responsible, not alone, but they are partly and directly responsible for the Holocaust, because it was they who denied Jews the ability to return to their own indigenous land, an international promise they themselves had committed to in 1920 and were now reneging on flagrantly.
That's a very powerful statement and very true, very historically accurate. And just to add what you were saying, so there was this famous ship, the Exodus. There were 4,500 Jewish immigrants. It was ordered to return back to Nazi Germany.
If you've seen the movie, let me tell you, yes, if you've seen the movie, let me tell you now, the reality was much, much worse.
Right.
The ship Exodus, in Hebrew, literally coming out of Europe on the phrase, on the scale of coming out of Egypt. That's how much it meant to the people on board. It was running away from certain doom. It was stopped. This was after World War II. But the mandate authorities, even though the war was over, did not change anything. They forced they completely choked off any Jewish repatriation. They, as you said, stopped every single vessel entering Palestine, mandatory Palestine territorial waters, and were sent either, at least it was more of a transit camp. That was not where people were actually held for very long. They were held for years on Cyprus, on camps in Cyprus, and back in Germany. They were sent back in Germany, where they were guarded by former alumni of the Wehrmacht, now in British employ.
Exactly, and that will give rise to the Beitar movement that helped move Jews quickly around, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But you were saying before about all these restrictions. So the British placed restrictions also on the ability of Jews to purchase land in Israel, and it pushed the Arabs part and parcel to acquire greater tracts of property in comparison, right? So the Jewish land purchases was reduced to just 5% of the already heavily partitioned Palestine. So already you have 22% of this land that was not only promised, like I even hate to say the word promise as if it's a gift, right? So Transjordan literally was a gift, right? Like, here you go, you have nothing to do with this land. Thank you for helping us during World War I. Please and thank you. For, Israel, Palestine was not a gift to Jews. It has been our land. It was basically a return to the rightful owners, as you were saying. So I have this quote here that by 1949, the British had allotted 87,500 acres of the 187,500 acres of cultivable land to the Arabs. Okay, right. So they're getting 10% of this land basically, and only, and this is a staggering statistics, only 4,250 acres to the Jews.
Because they wanted the Jews out. This was very, very obvious. Right. And the Jews refused to budge. There were all sorts of insane kind of restrictions, such as it's not a residence unless there is it's surrounded by a wall and there's a tower involved, and all sorts of nonsense like that. And in the face of it, you are beginning to see more and more Jewish pushbacks. You begin to see Jewish resistance groups or becoming disillusioned.
We'll get to those really quickly, but I want to, just pivot back a little bit more to the contrast, right? So during the Ottoman Empire, it was these Ottoman rulers who were ruling from Damascus, basically. They had these
from Constantinople.
and from Constantinople, right? And so, well, and for both, right? And so they had these tracts of land all over Palestine, and they
Yeah.
would employ mostly Arab serfs, right? So these serfs would just, work the land. They were at times given opportunity to have deeds to the land, but actually being smart, they thought, we don't want to pay taxes, right? The taxes were high. So to avoid paying taxes, they said, we don't want any deeds to any land.
Yeah, you're talking about the absentee landlords. Yes,
Absentee.
they were those were Ottoman, Turkish, sometimes Arabic nobles who lived in three major centers: in Beirut, in Damascus, and, as I said, in Constantinople. Jews during the Ottoman period paid unbelievable amounts of money for land that was considered completely worthless.
It was
Where
up to
I
10
am,
times the amount too.
yeah, where I am right now, a city called Petah Tikva, it was literally nothing but marshes. It was considered so uninhabitable that the pioneers had to try to settle it multiple times, and they had to bring in eucalyptus trees just to suck up all the excess water and make the land possible to cultivate.
Right. So
This
that's
is
what I
just
want to, yeah. So that's what I want to contrast to our audience, right? It's that, again, the misinformation, the false narrative, right? Why it's so important to take back the narrative. So the false narrative out there is that Arabs owned all the property. The Jews came in after World War II as victims of the Holocaust, kicked out the Arabs.
completely false.
Really
Completely
So
false.
right. So what I want to, emphasize is that most of Israel was actually barren land. And even Mark Twain made those famous photographs. He did a photo essay book, and he said, like, nothing is here. It's dust dunes, it's emptiness. So where is everyone, right? And so what it's important to focus on is that when the British came in and imposed those land quotas, and they siphoned land away from Jews and encouraged Arab land purchases, that's where you have this inequality. And
Yes.
then, like you mentioned, they had, and I read this somewhere too, that the greatest Arab influx into Israel happened between the world wars, thanks to the British.
Yes.
And after Jews started to revitalize the land, right? It was the Jews in
1950. Exactly. Ironically, the Zionist pioneers created living conditions far superior to any in the former Ottoman Empire, because they created infrastructure, because they created industry, because they built they had building projects going on. They had top of the line understanding of agriculture, so things that the normal Arab serf, Falach, had no idea of what to do. The land was desolate.
Right. Whereas the Jews were clearing the marshes, the swamps of malaria. Nowhere else, like you said, in the Ottoman Empire, they were doing that.
So obviously, you would have, logically, you would have a lot of work migrants coming in from places like Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, trying to find better life for themselves and for the families, because there weren't any, there was nothing to live for in those places, and Israel represented for them a better life. So they came over here, and the British government just gave them lands. So it didn't even really bother tracking them or even pointing out that there was a very famous quote by a Jewish researcher in London, who was trying to get to mandatory documents about Arab migration, and she was like, what? That there is no such thing. But they literally didn't bother. They would stop every malnourished Jewish refugee who went through Auschwitz.
Mhm.
God forbid he tried to live here, but Arabs were freely invited even because
And like you said, from all over, the world, like anywhere they wanted to come, and then they were incentivized, right? They weren't
Mhm,
being sold the land 8 times of what it was worth, like it was for Jews. They were sold at many times a discount, sometimes, like you said, just given away. Here you go,
yeah,
here's a tract of land. And I also was doing research that when the UN was took over in 1945, the British actually had falsified data, and they lied and said that there was actually far more British deeds than far more Arab deeds than they actually were, because they really wanted to screw Jews over, even
mhm,
as they were leaving.
yeah, yeah. This now has involved a lot of. Can we move to the resistance movement
Yeah,
because
absolutely. That's the thing. Okay, so here you are, and like, how much more can Jews take, right? At this point, right? So
yeah.
they're being pushed back from their own land. They're being persecuted all over Europe. So who were these resistance groups, right? It's like we know about Jabotinsky, if you can talk about him a little bit more. So there
Mhm.
was the Haganah, there was Etzel, there was the Stern Gang, there was Irgun. If you could parse it
Yeah,
out.
I'll try to simplify it.
Yeah.
Basically, the more Jews became disillusioned with the British mandate, and the more they saw the rights being curtailed and the preference being given to Arabs, the more resistance grew. I think that's something that the British were completely unprepared for. It's just same as the Arabs. Actually, they were in their minds. Jews were not people who fought back.
Mhm.
Jews were people who do as they were told, and died when they were told, and lived how you told them to. It's the it's the sheep that doesn't bite the man. It's when it bites the man that becomes very, very surprising. But the whole point of Zionism was to regain that honor, to regain a fighting spirit, and not to let people push you around. And the Zionists had no intention of just letting the British do whatever they wanted with their own land, our own land, Jewish land. So what you basically had were three major resistance movements. The first one was Haganah, meaning defense. This was originally created to fight off against raids and pogroms perpetrated by Arabs and led by labor Zionism, um, specifically by Chaim Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion. Uh, while they weren't crazy about the British, they were willing to cooperate if that led to results. This was more or less the biggest free state sort of organization, because it wasn't just about fighting, though it was. The military wing of it was called the Palmach, Plugat Machatz, and were incidentally trained by a Zionist Christian Scottish officer called Charles Auld Wingate, which is still very admired in Israel to this day. But I'm getting off topic here. As I was saying, the Haganah also was involved in creating work in policing Jewish villages, settlements, communities, pretty much interfacing with by now, let's just call it what it is. It was an occupation, the occupation authorities. And you had two other ones who completely and utterly rejected any chance of talking to the British. As far as they're concerned, you might as well talk to the Arabs. There's nothing to you may get a pretense of sure, we're willing to cooperate, but they're just going to stab you in the back. So these were The major one was created by Jabotinsky, who was an intellectual from Russia. I think he was born in what was then Russia, but that became Poland. And he was just like the labor Zionism of Ben Gurion became the Labor Party in Israel, his revisionist Zionism, revisionist because it said we can't rely on the British to give us what we need, became the front runner of the Likud. This was Etzel, Irgun Tzva'i Leumi, which is National Military Organization. The British couldn't pronounce that, so they just call it Irgun, which means organization. Okay, so and the last one is the smallest one. At best, the largest, it probably were not more than a few hundred of members, is called Lehi, Lochamei Chirut Israel, Israel's Warriors for Liberation. These were they were justifiably to a degree viewed very disrespectfully by the British, who didn't even bother with an actual name. You just called them the Stern Gang after Avraham Yair Stern, who was their leader and was assassinated by the British when he was arrested in his apartment. He was handcuffed and then shot in the head, and because he was giving the British too much trouble. So
right, and they justified it because they considered them to be terrorists.
Actually, they didn't even they didn't even bother justifying anything. Mm-hmm. As far as they were concerned, there was even nothing even to talk about.
Right.
It's just like putting a dog down. You don't apologize when you put a dog down. That was their reasoning. What they justified was that when they executed by hanging Jewish resistance fighters, most of whom hadn't even actually did any fighting, no more than being in the wrong car at the wrong time or putting up posters that the British didn't like. Yeah, those they justified by calling them terrorists. Interestingly enough, if such things were happen under the 1949 Geneva Convention, these would be war crimes.
Right. And so can you, let's, head back a little bit in history. So not a lot is, again, right, being talked about how the Jews helped the British immensely in World War II. And
Correct.
So a lot of these Jewish resistance groups actually got their start by being in the military, right, and aiding the British.
That's correct.
They're fighting.
As I said, Haganah was willing to work with the British. And you really want to work with the British when the British's enemy is literally Hitler. Mm-hmm. Haganah was very happy to cooperate with the British in anything that had to do with Nazi Germany. There is a famous saying by Ben Gurion at the time: "We will fight the British as if there were no Germans, and we will fight the Germans as if there were no British."
Right. So they put a on one occupier to get rid of this evil in the world. And
exactly.
I find it really fascinating, though, that the Arabs were rewarded with free land by helping
exactly.
the World War I.
The Palmach, as I said, the military wing of the Haganah, the Palmach, was instrumental in leading Allied troops into Vichy-controlled Syria and Lebanon. This is how Moshe Dayan lost his eye.
Oh,
okay. by leading Allied soldiers against the Nazi enemy.
So it had nothing to do with Arabs later.
What?
So it had nothing to do with fighting.
Oh, the Arabs were there. I mean, they were there, but the point was not to capture something. It was a wound sustained in the service of the British Empire during World War II against Vichy-controlled, Nazi-controlled territory.
And you had mentioned, we were talking off camera, isn't it true that some in your own family also served?
Yes, that is correct. My maternal grandfather was a member of Haganah. He served he was stationed as an intelligence officer in Alexandria in Egypt, and he worked as a double agent. He did his job, but he also made sure that that all the information he was privy to, and in some cases even material, were delivered to the hands of his comrades in the Haganah.
Very interesting. And so like what I was saying, that it's such a contrast, right? So the Arabs got rewarded this land for helping in World War I, Jews helping in World War II, and some can arguably say,
while the British are actively preventing Jews from immigrating and thereby dooming them to die. The British knew exactly what they were doing. Everyone should understand that. The British were not surprised by any of the concentration camps and the death camps that they found after World War II. They knew exactly what was going on, and they made a conscious decision to screw the Jews over for the Arabs. Some of them, even to this day, confirm it and blame it on the political necessities of the time, because they were fighting against the Germans. They couldn't afford to antagonize the Arabs. Be that as it may, even in spite of such a betrayal, the Jews of Israel, soon to be Israel, were fighting and doing anything they could, parachuting people into Nazi occupied Europe in an effort to save as many as possible.
Absolutely. And so the resistance groups, right? So even within, against the British, within Jewish Palestine. So how exactly were they obtaining weapons, right? So were they just stealing weapons from? I know that they were breaking into some police, depots. Obviously, there's the Ayalon bullet factory, where the select members of the Haganah produced something like 2 million bullets, over a span of 3 years. But was this all coordinated? Was this just separate groups trying to steal any weapons they can to attack the British? Kind of paint a picture a little bit more of.
Okay, so basically, it was incredibly important for Jews to be able to be armed, and so that's immediately the first thing that they were denied of. Jews could not own weapons unless they were part of the mandatory police, which of course was heavily commanded by British and heavily dominated by Arabs. If you joined the British police, you would be sent against fellow Jews, and you would most likely not return alive once you had a couple of months in the job, and your Arab comrades would get a chance, they get a crack at you. Mm-hmm. So yes, it was extremely important for Jews at this time to have weapons. So basically, we had a lot of there were a lot of thefts going on from British bases. There were also illegal exports coming through by sea, by land routes, Sinai, or Lebanon, pretty much every single way they could come up with. Mm-hmm. And they were stored in numerous, and I literally mean that, numerous. I have no idea how many there were. It must have been at least thousands, if not tens of thousands, of weapon caches. Yes, there were also bullet factories, as you mentioned, but the most important side of it was the weapon caches. Pretty much everywhere they could think of, like my grandfather's attic, for example, was a weapons cache, because that weapon was not hidden there in order for some future glorious revolution or war of independence. It was needed right at the time, because there were constant attacks, constant pogroms, constant rioting by Arabs against Jews, encouraged
With the
and
aid of,
facilitated by the British by this point. By this point, if you ever heard of Haj Amin al-Husseini, he got his start, he got his title as Mufti, as Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, by the British themselves. These are the kind of people we're talking about. We're not talking about some kind of, we're talking about a war to survive.
Mhm.
And I do want to say, because you mentioned the various Jewish groups were not coordinated most of the time. Frequently, they even kind of screwed each other over. I don't think there's a lot of time to address this, because they could not agree on anything. The Haganah was labor, socialists. When I say socialist, it doesn't mean communist. I know Americans tend to say the two are the same, but do not really. Communism is sort of socialism, but not all socialism is communism. While the Etzel, or Irgun, as they were known by the British, were a lot more headstrong and unwilling to compromise. And Lehi was just doing their own thing. They had like no reservations whatsoever. So the one point I can vote, or I can point it and say this is where all three come together, is 1946, immediately after World War II, when the consequences of the Holocaust, they were known to the governments of the world. They were not known in Israel, not to the extent of it. And when it is known, people just snap. You have all those different groups just coming together and say, the hell with all the differences, we want our country and we want it now. We can't wait any longer, we can't put this off, we can't let internal strife divide us. And they create what is known as Nuat Hameri Ha'ivri, the Hebrew movement of revolt. Sadly, this didn't last very long. It lasted exactly a few months, which were very impressive, by the way, because at this point they were just going full out war, destroying bridges, carrying attacks against the British. This stops when the bombing at King David Hotel happens. This was basically
very proud moment in Jewish history. So by this
yes.
point, I just want to interject. So by this point, did the British already sense that they were on their way out, or were they still fighting these British resistance groups?
Look, when we were mentioning the Exodus, which was certainly not the only ship of its kind. So when you have members of the United Nations, people from America, people from all over the world, seeing your soldiers brutally shoot and beat up Holocaust survivors merely for wanting to go back to their ancestral homes, this paints you in a very bad light. I think that eventually the British would have left anyway. They were exhausted after World War II. They were losing their empire anyway. By mid-60s, any trace of imperial holdings was completely gone.
And they were just fighting India. India also won its independence right around that time.
But they did not know how to reconcile the fact that they were fighting very coordinated, very good at their jobs, the Jewish guerrilla underground forces, as well as at the same time being sort of televised is the wrong word here, but reported on in a very unflattering light.
So you're saying, so on one hand it was bad PR, and on the other hand it was these guerrilla tactics that were physically pushing them away. And then would you say that the bombing at the King David Hotel, was that the last straw for them?
No, I think the last straw for them came when basically you had a very colonial way of thinking that the British had at the time, which was if a subject would make trouble, then you would whip him. Like they were about to do this to prisoners of Etzel, and Begin sent them a note and said, "You will treat my men with honor. My men are soldiers; they are not your colonial lackeys. You have no right to treat them this way. You will treat them as the Geneva Convention dictates." The British went ahead with lashing and whipping them. So Begin did the same. He captured. He led a raid, captured in the middle of the night a number of British officers, had them flogged, and sent them home in their underwear. This made a laughingstock out of Britain, especially by France, who, after 5 years of Nazi occupation, was very eager to get some points. And again, you need to understand, this is being done by Jews.
Right.
This is
so not only exactly. So not only is it embarrassing that subjects are embarrassing them, but Jewish subjects.
Yeah, exactly.
Would not be more embarrassing.
The British tried to retaliate by hanging anyone who was remotely involved with this. So again, people who didn't actually kill anyone, but they hanged them. So Begin retaliates again. He captures two sergeants, British sergeants, and hangs them too.
Exactly.
And at this point, that's oddly enough,
this is the signal, right? That these.
This is the final straw. It's right. Basically the British say, "Why are we doing this?" It's not they understand. Oh my God, we're treating those people the wrong way. Far from it. Opinions in Britain are viciously anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, but they realize they can't crack down as much as they want to. So what they do instead was they look around, they see they have Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. All of them would be very willing to come in and wipe out all the Jews for them. So they just say, you know what, we quit. We're relinquishing the mandate. We're giving it back to the United Nations. Let the chips fall where they may. But of course, what they
deal with this, right? Exactly. And so we were talking off camera, I guess at this point a couple of weeks ago, that you did concentrate your master's degree in ancient Jewish history, right? And so we were talking a little bit, and I think this is fascinating to discuss at this point because we, in detail discussed the Jewish resistance groups that were prevalent in driving out the British. Did they find any strength themselves at the time? I mean, obviously they were busy physically fighting the British, but did they think of themselves as these ancient Jewish warriors that were also
absolutely
rebelling?
Absolutely, yes.
So could you tell us a little bit?
Ben Gurion took his name from a great revolt leader in Jerusalem, mentioned by Josephus.
Very interesting. And so, yes. Of course, we know about Bar Kokhba revolt. What were some other famous ones that might not be so widely known?
Well, probably the one which is most glossed over is the Kitas War or the Diaspora War, which was between 115 and 117 CE in the second century. Mistake. At the time Trajan was emperor, he was conquering Armenia and Mesopotamia, which especially Mesopotamia with Babylon, and was home to huge Jewish communities. And the soldiers massacred a part of the Jewish population. When Wodzowitz gets back to Judea and the neighboring communities in neighboring lands, open revolt breaks out, eventually concentrating in Lod in Israel, and again being crushed brutally by the Roman Empire. Side note: the Kitos War is the reason why there were no synagogues in Cyprus until a few years ago, because Jews were not allowed to live in Cyprus after the Kitos War.
Interesting.
So, yes. There was also a very famous, well, not that famous, but there was a well-documented point where the Byzantine Empire, the heir of the Roman Empire, was fighting the Persians, who were historically always allied with the Jews. By the time, and the Jews opened basically what is another front in Israel, recaptured Jerusalem and rule it for 14 years, just prior to before they surrender it to Byzantine hands, just prior to the Arab conquest. The Byzantines took the Temple Mount, and in revenge, we turned it into the city dump. I remind you, this is supposedly holy ground for Christianity, but it doesn't seem to matter to them. So this is basically, yeah. So when the Arabs get to Jerusalem and build Haram al-Sharif, this is what they built it on, because it was returned by the Christians into a dump.
And I think it's interesting that the Supreme Muslim Council in 1924 had a brochure in which it describes just how much the Temple Mount meant to the Jews. And they quoted David and the altar. So they know, you know, even though they don't want to admit it these days, but they absolutely know. And so you're right, like, you know, we have such a great history of warriors. And we're going to have having another, my actually next podcast is about Jewish strength. There's such a misnomer that Jews are weak and we don't fight. We come from warriors, right? So one of my, I guess, most rooted moments of my Jewish identity was when I was in Judea and Samaria in 2018. It was my first time in the heartland of our ancestral homeland, and standing on those hills, I literally could feel the strength of our warriors running through my veins, right? So, like, you know, I'm Jewish, I'm 100% Jewish. I felt it and it energized me. And so I can only imagine how these resistance groups were feeling fighting an actual occupier. So I think that's important to remember. It's not just these random Jewish rebels in the 1930s and 40s. They were built on thousands of years of Jews who have strength and were fighting back oppressors.
Absolutely.
So I thank you so much. You know, I think we had a dynamic discussion about something that's very much overlooked in a lot of today's, the narrative on Israel. People seem to forget about the British occupation, right? Like they talk about World War II and the Holocaust, and then suddenly in 1945, and forgetting all of that history and what Jews were experiencing in the British under the British mandate. So I thank you so much, Ido, for your time, for your knowledge, for your wisdom, and for educating myself and our audience with a lot more detail. Thank you so much.
It was my pleasure.
Absolutely. Have a good day and have a good night for those joining in other parts of the world. Thank you.
You too. Bye.